Hi, folks. Thanks for joining. I see folks still entering into the Zoom, so we're going to give it just a couple more minutes and start at 2 after the hour. These are always the longest 2 minutes of the presentation. Just waiting to get started.
Can stare at our amazing faces for the first 2 minutes.
You know. Maybe for some of the folks that have already joined, feel free to drop in where you're dialing in from. I'm calling in from Reno, Nevada. We just moved here about 6 months ago. Digging it so far, pretty dry and warm still, so happy.
I'm currently in the Bay, usually live in San Diego. Definitely much nicer weather down there than where I am right now. Definitely feel free to drop in the Q&A section at the bottom if you have anything you're looking to learn today, things that you'd like us to cover, areas of interest. Definitely drop those in here as well. Obviously, we know engineering productivity has a ton of different facets, which is why we're doing this webinar in the first place. So if you have specific things you're interested, go ahead and drop them in the chat.
Brett, you didn't tell us where you're dialing in from.
Yeah, I'm also in the Bay Area. I'm up in Napa these days. Yeah.
Oh, nice. All right, 2 after the hour. It's probably a good time to get started. Thanks everyone for joining us. We are here to talk engineering productivity, but we want to move beyond the metrics in this conversation. My name is Lauren. I look after product marketing at Cortex. I'm also joined by Ganesh, who I'll let introduce himself.
Yeah. Hey, folks. My name is Ganesh. I'm one of the co-founders and CTO Cortex. Previously, I was in fintech for a while, got to see the monolith to microservice journey, the engineering organization growing, all the challenges that came with that, whether it was understanding ownership of services, all the way to kind of just getting the entire organization moving in the same direction, all fun challenges to deal with, and decided to start Cortex to help with some of those. And I would like to hand it over to Brett, who is one of our close partners at Docker. He's been a phenomenal person to work with, has given us tons of feedback, and excited to kick off this conversation around engineering productivity with him. So I'll hand it over to you, Brett.
Yeah, thanks for having me. My name is Brett Inman. I run the platform group at Docker. That includes 3 teams and about 20 engineers. And really, our job is to make every other team at Docker better, more efficient, provide them with the systems to do their jobs and worry about building features and not about all the boilerplate that we can take care of for them. That's what we do.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Really quickly, if you're not familiar with Cortex, I just wanted to give a quick overview of who we are. We're an internal developer portal designed to help developers take ownership over the state and quality of their software in the most efficient way possible. We're not going to spend a huge amount of time talking specifically about Cortex. We do have some things that we want to talk about in the back half of the presentation because we did just launch a new product that relates to this conversation around developer productivity and measuring productivity and bringing more context into the equation. But we do want to spend the front half of the presentation really digging into why developer productivity is such a hot topic right now, why it feels a little bit contentious, why it feels like engineering in particular amongst all groups in the organization right now are sort of in the crosshairs for this debate. And I also am going to ask questions of Ganesh and Brett about their experiences to date in trying to measure this. So let's go ahead and get started here. What's happening with the dev productivity debate? First question up, I'm going to ask of Brett. Why do you think we're talking or hearing more about productivity right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of levels, it's a natural progression of this movement towards DevOps and being able to do things more efficiently and more automated. So, like, yes, we automated a lot of systems, we made those better. The question now is, it's not just about systems, it's about people and processes, right? So do we have the right processes in place? Or do we build and structure our teams the correct way? What else plays into how fast we ship things and what we can get done with the limited time that we have? I think it's just a natural progression of that, and the ability now with all these tools coming out to help us measure these things, it's perfect timing.
Yeah. So this feels kind of like a byproduct of some of the bigger technology shifts that have happened recently, like a big shift to microservices, Kubernetes, containerization, and this feels like the next frontier. Now that you have the tech kind of ready to move quickly, you also need to make sure your people are doing the same. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think it's also a complexity thing too. Like with all these tools, I mean, it's now really hard to keep track of what is everyone doing. Like, are we doing the right things? Is this the right process? Is it the right tool for us? And are we finding that actually this is slowing us down, or this is causing developers to be really unhappy because they hate working with this tool? Um, and those are hard questions to answer, and everyone wants data. So the more data we can get on these processes, the better.
Yeah. Ganesh, next question for you. Why does this feel like such a contentious topic right now?
Yeah, I think it's because there's a whole bunch of reasons. I think it comes down to productivity is such a weird thing to track when it comes to engineering. Like engineering, obviously, as we know, is there's a lot of like art design kind of things that go into it. It's kind of it's a craft. That's how we view it, right? It's you can put a time box on something and say we're going to ship something in 2 days, and things can get more complicated. Uh, things have complexity, and when you're trying to measure productivity in complex areas, I think what ends up happening is you create metrics that are kind of heuristics to things that you care about, which aren't actually capturing the business impact. Like to Brett's point, if it's because we're talking about productivity, is because we're trying to ship more, trying to ship faster, make sure developers are happy, like finding those bottlenecks, then how can we capture all of that in a bunch of metrics that then become gamed? I think the worry around engineering metrics is also that they become the ends versus the means. Like it's like, hey, how are we tracking productivity? And then eventually the actual focus becomes tracking productivity versus what is the impact of the stuff that we're building, right? And I think once you get to that level, then productivity metrics, I mean, naturally people end up gaming them and you lose sight of what is actually important to the organization. And I think especially because, we haven't really had a clear story around productivity. I think we're in that early phase of the conversation where there are going to be, folks kind of advocating for the extremes of let's not track anything, let's track everything. And I think the answer is probably somewhere in the middle, as they tend to be. But it's probably one of the reasons why it's contentious. It's just where we are in the cycle of this conversation as well.
So it's possible in future it won't always carry this kind of potentially negative connotation, but we're just very early in the ability to actually measure things. And now we're starting to argue about how should we actually measure them.
Yeah, exactly. Like a great example of this, and I think I'm sure a lot of the people who are attending have dealt with this before. Great example is OKRs, right? OKRs, well meant. It's meant to help organizations kind of set goals, break it down into different smaller chunks, spread it across the organization, give people ownership. But I think at one point the pendulum swung so far that you had just so many rituals around OKR tracking and whether you're meeting your OKRs, you kind of lost sight of why are we meeting these goals in the first place? Like it's not just to meet the goals, it's to build the business. And I think we've kind of swung that back a little bit where people understand the meaning of goals and OKRs and like we're not spending as much time around the rituals of tracking. And I think engineering productivity is probably going to go the same way.
We might have covered this next one a little bit with Brett in the opening here, but measurement is not a new thing for lots of the different teams and an organization. Obviously, the sales team probably feels this acutely, marketing feels this as well. Why does it feel like engineering is at the center of this conversation right now, while every part of the organization needs to go and optimize? Maybe for either, maybe Ganesh, if you want to take it.
I can talk about this a little bit.
Yeah,
I
go
think
for it.
at least for a tech company, it's the engineering is the way by which we ship product. And so while every part of the company is important, like what we're usually waiting for as far as being able to do new things is product teams. And so they get the bulk of the making sure that we're actually doing things appropriately and we're putting people in the right places, we're investing in the right things is probably one of the highest concerns for the business. Ganesh, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
That's exactly what I was going to say. I think, many of the other functions we think about can, over the last decades, we've understood how to quantify productivity to some degree, or at least understand bottlenecks and like lagging indicators and all these things. Like you think about go to market, like marketers and salespeople like intimately understand their funnels, their pipeline, and the different stages, and we know how to like suss out information from those things. But engineering, I think, for so long we've just been in like, let's keep moving, let's ship, let's build technology platforms, and we're getting to a world where I think for the most part, like our tech stacks are fairly mature. We're able to ship quickly. Tech is not really the blocking thing for engineering teams. We're getting to a world where people, process, those kinds of things are starting to add up over time. Whereas in the past, like there was so much investment we needed to make in infrastructure to get there. And so I think that's one of the reasons why, we're starting to realize, hey, like if people and process is so important, how are we understanding our bottlenecks? And I think the other thing that we're seeing is, especially, I think, COVID and everything really accelerated this with remote work, but companies just, I think, have even more demand for product velocity and shipping new features, and customers are not changing their needs and their requirements. People have tons of things they need from their software because that's how they drive their own efficiencies, is the tools that they're buying. And so therefore requirements for your vendors go up and your vendors go up and so on and so forth. So now everybody has tons of things they need to ship. And all of a sudden it's like, hey, how do we ship more with the people that we have and do that in a really efficient way while keeping our engineers happy? Because a big part of engineering productivity is if engineers are feeling like they're bogged down and they're being really slow, they feel unhappy. Right? If I was getting stuck on things, I would feel unhappy. And so part of it is also like a knowledge thing. Like if you lose people in your development team, you're losing tons of knowledge and context. So how do you keep the morale high? How do you keep your developers satisfied and happy and growing? Engineering productivity feeds into that, because the more people are able to ship things fast and do the things that they like, the happier they'll be, the more likely they are to stay, and so on. So there's all kinds of trickle down effects as a result of this broader productivity conversation.
Yeah. And I really want to double click on the focus that you just put there on the ability of the organization to do more and ship faster. And Brett, when we were talking about this last week, you had a similar point where I had brought up that I think some people feel a little bit nervous about the topic of measuring productivity and efficiency because some people have this idea that the organization will use it to eliminate engineers, find the ones that are not operating at maximum capacity, use it as a way of filtering out people who aren't working really hard. And that's not the direction that we want to take this conversation. Brett, I don't remember exactly the phrase that you used. Maybe people weren't looking to cut headcount, they're looking to maximize output, or they're looking to help the team improve the way that they work. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, like the way we look at this is it's not at all about cost cutting. It's about we're making investments in headcount. We're making investments in assigning headcount to different projects, products, features. Are we making the right choices? And then are we giving people the right processes to actually achieve these things in the way that we want them to be achieved? 99.9% of the time, if we identify problems in velocity or anything else in the team, it's not because of people, it's because of the processes that we've given them, because they're working around a really terrible process, or it's just not an efficient way of doing things. And so it's really data for the organization to take back and say, what can we improve? And that's my job on the platform side of things. Is this is literally the input for all the work that we do, is where are developers hurting? Where are they losing time? Or just what products are not working and we need to reinvest in something else and move people around if necessary. But it's never a question of like, should we fire some people? It's always a question of where do we need to hire more, at least in my case.
Yeah. And I do feel like some of that nuance is missing from some of the ways that people are reporting that they're measuring these things today. So we had done a survey a little while back. I'm not going to read all the responses on this page here, but what you're looking at is a result of asking a question to engineering leaders: how does your organization measure engineering efficiency and developer productivity? This was just a general market survey, so not specifically of Cortex customers. But I highlighted some of the trends here, and it's more than just these responses. We had probably 20 or so responses that we pulled in all together, but the theme is the same. It's very metrics oriented, and there isn't a lot of nuances in the responses about how folks look behind those numbers to actually understand what's happening. And I think that this is a problem that exists in the market today, is that it's not easy to kind of measure things quickly and easily, but B, we don't really have a codified process or a framework for adding additional context to these numbers. So you see folks looking at features shipped, lines of code committed, some people who say that maybe they're not measuring it very well. Folks creating kind of impromptu dashboards, looking at Jira tickets, Git commits, Confluence docs. Does this surprise either of you, what you kind of see on the screen? We're not seeing a lot of like nuance or context behind these numbers. Does that seem normal for the way that folks are measuring this today?
Yeah, I think in my experience trying to measure things on platform, it's a lot of, you're measuring a lot of what I kind of refer to as like proxy metrics. Like we don't, it's very hard to measure how processes affect an end outcome for a business, like the number of seats that we sell, or you know, the number of people using these features. You know, like if we improve one of our GitHub workflows, does that how do you measure the actual outcome on product? That's a little hard. So we start looking at proxy metrics where we say, well, if we know that our developers are opening and closing PRs faster, getting things merged faster, our assumption is that we are shipping code more, and that means that we are shipping new features, which helps us, you know, sell more, right? So we rely a lot on assumptions, and we kind of try to build that chain of trust of like, if we're making this better, other things are getting better. And then the other side of that is we back that up by, so this is like hard data, but we back that up by like survey data from our engineers, where we ask them about these processes and we get NPS scores for them and everything else. So we try to say like, you know, okay, we see that there's a low score for something like, I don't know, PR review time. People aren't getting their PRs reviewed quickly enough. So we make an effort. We talk to all the engineering managers. We make sure that we set aside time for this. And a month later, now what does it say? Does that number go up or down? So I think it's really the triangulation of a lot of different kinds of metrics to make sure that you're actually having an impact.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And like that kind of being the ideal way to start looking at metrics. And I think this survey definitely encapsulates what we've seen in the market in our conversations. It's like people clearly are desperate to get an understanding of something. It's like, hey, what's happening? What's out there? Are there numbers I can look at? Because as the organization grows larger, it's not that you can go and review every PR and see what's happening and make an assessment for yourself. Like you need data at some point to help you make decisions. And people start pulling in random metrics to hopefully point them in that direction. I think the theme that we're seeing, in these responses is like there's not really correlations between a lot of these things, right? It's like story points committed to bug count defects. It's like, and kind of if you squint, maybe there's some meaning between those two metrics, but it's not that much. And so people are kind of just piecing things together as they find issues and bottlenecks, but there isn't really a clear story around what exactly are people trying to answer with these metrics. I think people are feeling like they need some visibility and they're trying to answer that for themselves. And I think that's where the conversation is naturally shifting and why there's been more focus around this stuff. So yeah, definitely something that we're seeing.
Yeah, Brett, I actually think you just answered perfectly. How does Docker think about this, or how had they been thinking about this? It sounds like you are mashing more of the qualitative and quantitative where you can, because it sounds important to you to bring that context together and actually understand what are these numbers actually telling us. Have either of you seen peers at other companies approaching measurement in a different way, or ideas that have sparked something for you? Maybe Ganesh, have you seen
Yeah,
anything? Oh, go ahead, Brett.
I mean, I think the slide you showed previously, like there's a lot of stuff out there, and I think there's there's a lot of popularity around Dora, because it's a pretty easy thing to begin measuring. I think the next step for most people, and this was the hardest thing for us, is like, cool, we can measure these things. What are we actually doing about it? And what does it actually say? Like, let's say number of deployments. Like, if your engineers are saying that it's really hard to deploy, and because of that, they're not deploying very often, that's a problem. But if you're deploying several times a day and that they don't say it's a problem, do you actually need to increase that number or not? Like, what is your actual target and what are you doing based on it? So I think the next step there is adding that your organization's goals to that and saying, like, why does this matter? And is this actually the right metric? Or should we just measure this and make sure it doesn't trend downward, but it's not an actual, focus for us right now? So I think that's the thing, is like there's lots of different, I mean, space metrics and other things like that. There's lots of different systems, but I think the hard question is, what are you actually going to do with it once you have it?
Yeah. I think we've talked a lot about what might be missing from the way that things are being measured today. Ganesh, do you have any other thoughts there about what's potentially missing?
Yeah, I think the business context that Brett mentioned is super important. Like, I think one of the reasons Dora, I think, is actually fairly reasonable as a metric to use, because to Brett's earlier point, it's kind of like a proxy metric. It's a proxy metric for many, 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 many things. right? Deploy frequency can be affected by your confidence in your code, your testing capabilities, your deployment capabilities, CI/CD, review times, like everything kind of goes into deploy frequency. If you're not able to deploy, there's probably something going wrong behind the scenes, and you can start to investigate that. So things like Dora and Space, I think, are particularly interesting, more so than lines of code and commits and things like that, because it does capture more meaningful impact from the engineering team. However, I think what's been missing there is, again, context on the other things. Like, okay, if I'm tracking deploy frequency, am I also tracking the other things that it's tracking underneath the scenes? Like, what is it a proxy to? And can I track those things that it's proxying in some way so that I can then start to piece things together and say, hey, these two things look kind of out of whack. Are these potentially the reasons why our deploy frequencies were down or change failure rates been down? So I think that kind of context has been definitely missing. And I think the other thing is, because we don't have a lot of context on these proxy metrics behind the Dora metrics, again, we're seeing Dora becoming the goal. Like, you hear organizations all the time talking about, we didn't increase our deploy frequency. It's like, okay, well, how are you going to do that? You can't just go and beat people on the head with a stick and say, like, okay, you gotta ship more. Because if you do that, then people will just ship smaller things and game that metric. So it's really around that context. I think context is missing. I think breaking down those like bigger metrics into smaller, more understandable pointers and indicators has been like the biggest theme that we're seeing.
Yeah, which is probably a good segue into talking a little bit about what we've seen here at Cortex. I think that we have the advantage of essentially acting as the system of record for the engineering team. So we are bringing in a lot more context from across the stack. And that really got us thinking, what would be the best way to augment this data with any metrics about the team's productivity or efficiency, and how do those two things cycle back into one another so that metrics don't become kind of the end state? But maybe Ganesh, you can kind of talk about the rest from here.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about this because it's going to be, a lot of the context that we're talking about. How do we actually make sense of these metrics? How do we turn productivity measurement into something useful that helps us make better decisions as engineering leaders about the organization versus just looking at metrics and being sad that things aren't happening? Cool. All right, so we can start with leading versus lagging, right? We've been talking about this throughout the entire conversation. I think the biggest thing that we need to do in engineering as part of this conversation is change the way we talk and think about these metrics, right? We should not be using these metrics as conclusions. These are not the ends. These are not the things that we're trying to move directly, but they're more helping us understand whether the other things that we're doing are helping. We talk a lot about like inputs and outputs, right? Inputs are the things you can control. Things you can control are things like your testing practices and your CI/CD and all these other things we were just talking about. Those are things in your control. And if you change those things, if you change those variables, are you seeing things change in these metrics? And that's kind of the way to look at engineering productivity metrics. Is they're lagging indicators. They're showing you if something you have done has meaningfully impacted the metrics you have versus trying to just move those metrics as a target themselves. And I think one of the big things that this changes is it creates a culture of investigation. It's more, you're driving curiosity. You're asking yourself, hey, why am I seeing these metrics not move? What have we changed? It's more of an experimental culture. It's a culture about continuous improvement, and it reduces the gamification aspect of it. You're not trying to get people to gamify these numbers because they're not being graded on it. They're not being, the performance reviews aren't affected by these numbers. It's really to help engineering leaders understand their organization better and make those decisions around where they should be investing more time and energy in.
And hopefully encouraging more vulnerability too. So folks feel comfortable kind of speaking to what their numbers are, what the metrics are, and start a dialogue with your manager with an understanding that this is not the end goal, that there's a story behind this. Or maybe I'm a person on my team who is providing a lot of mentorship and a lot of guidance, and it's understood with my manager that my numbers are going to always look a little bit different from other peers on my team. And making sure that you feel comfortable owning that context and stepping into that role confidently, because we need people like that on every team.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, one of the things that happens as you start thinking about this as a lagging indicator is it becomes something that like individual developers will start looking at. Because I think if you take engineering productivity metrics, an individual developer isn't going to care about like my story point velocity or something. I'm never going to look at the dashboard. I can tell you that. But if it becomes a lagging indicator, then developers are craftspeople. We care about our craft. We want to ship better. It's just hard to understand like what we can be doing more. Like that kind of direction is super useful. And so if you turn into a lagging indicator, now all of a sudden it's interesting to me to say, hey, like where are areas that I can be improving or helping my team improve because it's something that can point us in the right direction. I think about this very similar to like APM or monitoring, right? It's like, yes, there's some things that will drive alerts and whatnot, but good engineers are looking at their metrics and saying, hey, are we is our latency starting to drop? Are there things that are happening on our our queries? Are queries taking too long? Hey, let me go and investigate that. The same way, there's no reason why productivity metrics can't be the same thing. And I think the other thing that'll happen as part of this conversation is, one of the things, and maybe this is a little bit of a hot take for a webinar, but I don't know how I feel about industry benchmarks for these kinds of metrics. I think a lot of people when they talk about productivity metrics, they compare them to industry benchmarks, and it's like, hey, the best companies who are a similar size as us in a similar space are deploying 10 times a day. Okay, cool. Well, are they not as critical to their customers? Are they newer? There's so many things that can be different around the organization. In some ways, industry benchmarks are proof that people are treating these things as an end. They're like, oh, we got to get to this number. But if you look at them as lagging indicators, and all of a sudden looking at industry benchmarks is not that useful because you're looking at it as a way to drive continuous improvement. It's, hey, here's where we are. We're trying to improve on certain aspects. Let's go try something and see if we're improving relative to ourselves, relative to our team, our company, our organization. And so it completely changes the way you think about these metrics from being a goal to being something you're trying to improve through other means.
So maybe benchmarking could be important, but it should be more of where were we as a team 3 months ago? Where
Exactly.
are we now? Okay.
Exactly. Benchmark against yourself.
Yeah. Okay. So this first pillar here seems like it's mostly about reframing the conversation and setting up a new framework for thinking about metrics. The next pillar here, bringing in more context, is how we get a little bit more tangible and actually how we go about fulfilling that framework. So can you talk a little bit more about that one, Ganesh?
Yeah, absolutely. Like a great example of this is, we were talking about this around deploy frequency. If you just have a dashboard with 4 metrics of the 4 Dora metrics, there's no context. It's like, okay, deploy frequency on this team is really bad. Okay, then what? Is it because maybe that team owns a monolith and the bills just take an hour and there's nothing you can really do about it, but they're shipping great code. They don't have that many incidents. They haven't had like things that have to be rolled back. Maybe that's a reasonable comparison for that team. Maybe their PRs are taking super long. Okay, well, is that because reviews are taking really long? Maybe. Okay, are the reviews really long because their PRs are really, really big and people are taking a long time to even start reviewing them? Okay, well, now all of a sudden we're able to trace this back and say, hey, the deploy frequency is actually the output of a bunch of other inputs to that function. And so having that context in one place, like if you're tracking those metrics, you should be tracking the other things that are inputs into that, because then you can start interrogating your own metrics and saying, hey, I'm starting to piece together an image of different teams. You're not just comparing teams against each other saying, you're deploying 5 times a day and you're deploying 1 time a day, but it's trying to understand why those things may be true and where those areas for improvement are. So context is key, and we understand this in so many cases, right? It's like if your latency metric is dropping to a certain number, or you're not meeting a certain threshold, you can't just compare 2 services against each other and say like, oh, well, you're responding in 100 milliseconds, you're responding in 10 milliseconds. The criticality of the services might be different. They might be more IO intensive. There might be different use cases for those. The SLOs might be different. And so if you can't compare metrics against 2 services, how can you compare teams and productivity metrics? You need that context to make sense of it. And I think that's part of the conversation that's really missing today.
Yeah, and I think there's 2 layers to that context conversation. One is the context of just numbers themselves. So if you're looking at PR open and close time, you might come to one conclusion, but then if you go and look at that team's PR size, maybe that would change what some of your conclusions are. So there's comparing metrics to one another, but then there's also the context outside of those numbers that we've talked about. Like, what do we know about this team? Who's on the team? Are new people onboarding right now? Have they switched projects? Are they dealing with like particularly complex projects that should necessarily change what their numbers look like compared to other teams? But again, that also helps us eliminate that mentality of this team versus this team, or this person versus that team, or person versus person. Brett, when you had mentioned, I think you mentioned earlier some of the qualitative surveys that you do, that sounds like your attempt to bring in more context outside the numbers. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, really the question should start with, what are your problems and what are you trying to do and what is your goal? And then you should be picking metrics that help track that. It shouldn't be, I have a list of metrics, this looks low, let's do something about it. The question is it being low a problem? Like going back to Ganesha's example, there might be teams that own a service that's a monolith, or that it is a service that is stable and they're not spending a lot of time on this service and they only deploy it once a month, and that's fine because it's stable and performant and it's working. So you never want to just directly measure against any particular benchmark. The question is the opposite: is what is your problem and what numbers would show that you're fixing that problem? Yeah, it's the complete opposite. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good segue, I think, into the last pillar here that we recommend: having a plan to action. What are you doing with the numbers? What's the so what? But really starting from the like, what are you trying to solve? How do you use the numbers to solve that? And then what comes next? Ganesh, can you talk more about this one?
Yeah, absolutely. I think this kind of goes back to the concept of like inputs and outputs, right? It's, you see certain things that are maybe bottlenecks or areas for improvement. How do you turn that into something that's very tactical for that individual team? To Brett's point, it might be, that team is doing great because of X, Y, and Z inputs. And so let's not give them the same action items as maybe a team that isn't doing those things. And I'll take a simple example of code coverage. Again, code coverage is, a reasonably useful metric. It's not the end all be all. Again, it shouldn't be your target metric, but it's a reasonable indicator of, do you have high enough testing coverage of your code base that you have confidence to deploy? Is a reasonable thing to assume about code coverage metrics. And so if you see that people are taking, a long time to deploy, maybe, you're bringing more context, you start breaking that down by code coverage and test suite information. And we say, hey, you know what, actually the teams that are deploying faster have more code coverage. Okay, let's drive that initiative across the organization. Let's maybe focus on the teams that, haven't had the time or resources to invest in that. Let's go give them that tooling. Let's give them the time to go and improve their testing and see if we see improvement in those metrics. And so by making it really clear and focused to those teams, now you're telling teams exactly like, hey, this is what we're trying. This is the experiment. We're going to try this thing. We're going to see what happens. We're not telling them like, oh my God, if you do this and your deploy frequency doesn't improve, it's a failure. This is an experiment. It's customized. It's tailored to your individual team, and we're going to see how that improves it. Then all of a sudden you're kind of iterating towards the right direction over time versus just creating a bunch of noise and not making things tailored to that individual team. Because to Brett's point, maybe the team is totally fine and your code coverage is fine. So why should you be bothered with all this noise around, oh, we got to improve code coverage? Like, let's keep it very, very tailored and focused and let people focus on the things that matter. Because again, going back to the deploy frequency, code coverage could be one thing. It could also be your CI/CD processes. Maybe one of the things we want to try is, if we want to automatically deploy to our dev environment, it's not a manual step, so that way it's just a promotion to production. Okay, well, maybe my team has already done the code coverage stuff. How can we immediately get them context around, and the next thing we're going to try out is this new CI/CD process. Okay, let's focus on that. So different teams might be in different places in their engineering maturity journey. And so the less noise each of those teams have, the more they can improve. So that's kind of how I think about having plans to action.
Perfect. I'm sure all of you probably saw where this was headed. We've taken kind of these three pillars of how we think that this problem should be solved, and recognized that having things inside of a system of record would make this process a lot easier. So we did just last week launch a new product called Eng Intelligence. I think the name here is really important. I think when we tend to talk about these things, we think about dev metrics or eng metrics. And the point is, again, that we don't want to be focusing on the numbers themselves. We want to be using the numbers as intelligence combined with context from across the rest of the engineering team to actually move the team forward, to improve the way that they work, to unblock them. And that's kind of some of our philosophy going into this, but I'll pass it over to Ganesh to kind of introduce what the product looks like, and then we'll talk a little bit more about how Docker is using it as well.
Cool. Yeah, super excited to announce this. And like Nora mentioned, this is really, really focused on intelligence. How do we become smarter as an organization? How do we drive more context? How do we help ourselves make better decisions around engineering productivity, using this as a source of information and, as the name says, as a source of intelligence? And so with Cortex, as Lauren mentioned earlier, Cortex is a developer portal. We view ourselves as a system of record. It is a source of truth for information about your services, all the different connections to your services, whether it's on call and monitoring and security and code coverage. It's a source of truth for your teams and team members, team structure. It's a source of truth for your best practices and standards through our scorecards product. You can drive service maturity standards, you can drive production checklists, you can drive security standards, all those kinds of things through the developer portal. And so, when we thought about it, we realized that Cortex was doing an amazing job at controlling the inputs. We helped organizations understand the lay of the land, what's out there, their ownership, understanding how their services are performing, whether they're meeting those standards, whether people are building the way they should be building. And then we thought about, hey, how do we help organizations create a feedback loop inside their developer portal to drive additional improvements? And so that's where engineering intelligence came in. And so what we wanted to do is bring in all that context, bring in all those tools into a single place. And so Cortex engineering intelligence product basically helps you track everything from DORA metrics around incidents, around PR cycle time, your scorecards, so code like quality metrics, reliability metrics, ownership, all those kinds of things, and overlay them against each other to help you understand, hey, where are our bottlenecks? What can we be improving? How have we been trending over time? And bring that into the system of record helps you make better decisions around that, which is why I'm super excited to be launching this today. And one of the things that I like to say is I've been beta testing this internally for 6 months, and our engineering organization has grown a bunch over the past 6 months. And as people were onboarding, I was actually able to see metrics moving and see the context in the organization. And we made changes, and we broke down the team in different ways, and we had these efforts around, hey, let's go and try to improve how fast we're reviewing PRs because we're seeing bottlenecks there. Being able to see those metrics in our own engineering intelligence product was really, really powerful and validated that we were doing the right things, which is why I'm excited to bring this out to the world.
Thanks, Ganesh. I did want to talk a bit about how some of our early adopter customers are starting to use this product and kind of explain a little bit of what that workflow looks like to bring it to life for folks. What you're seeing here on the right-hand side is a very basic, what we call architecture in marketing, flow of information from your kind of critical data sources into analysis about how these metrics are changing over time, but more importantly, using that data to inform or update the scorecards that you would be using in Cortex. So scorecards are a way of setting standards for the organization or different teams about production readiness, software maturity, security, really anything your organization cares deeply about and wants to start to standardize or improve consistency around, you can create a scorecard for. So an example here of the flow through might be tracking door or space metrics. Maybe it's important to you to see which teams have fastest PR close rate this month, but more importantly, like, do you want to set a minimum standard? Is it even appropriate to do that, given how different a lot of the different teams are, and they might have different areas of focus? You can also add context. So think critically about what the numbers actually mean. Time to review might be up, but maybe incidents are actually down, and that's obviously a net positive thing for the organization. You can drive change as well using some of the scorecards. So add a rule to keep change failure rate under 5%, perhaps. It's a nice iterative process to start to look at the metrics and say, are there any common denominators here or things that we think would be appropriate for everybody to start doing or this particular team to start doing? And then make decisions from there about how you actually want to be segmenting those areas of advice. Ensure speedy ramp is another good one as well. This is a pretty popular use case just for IDPs in general, making sure that new developers have access to all the information that they need. But you can also use it to gut check how you as a leader are doing to actually help your team get onboarded. So is somebody ramping at the speed that you would expect them to based on how other new people have actually onboarded? If they're not, you can look back at the scorecards for the services or resources or software that they have ownership over. Are there rules already in place to include things like documentation that would help people ramp faster? I think that there's something here that Brett's going to talk about in just a second, but improving dev satisfaction as well, augmenting qualitative feedback with quantitative data is pretty important. So if you're getting feedback from your team, for example, the documentation's not great. I know this is a common complaint for developers. Maybe I've just onboarded or switched teams and I don't actually know what's what or what these things mean or what this service or resource actually does. And now all of a sudden I own it. You could create rules and scorecards that require you to have a README file or other documentation appended to every software component that you own before it actually goes into production. Probably a good segue to pass it over to Brett in a second to talk a little bit about how Docker is using Edge Intelligence. It's still early days. So we're going to talk a little bit more about what they were doing before, what you're doing right now, what you're measuring, who has access, and what your hopes are for the future of using this product. So we'll start with measurement here. What are the data sources that you're feeding into Edge Intelligence?
Yeah, so we we started using Cortex before Edge Intelligence was a feature, and we had linked in a bunch of different data sources and systems that we use. So we have GitHub linked in, so all of our information about PRs and code coverage and everything else is pulled into there. We have PagerDuty linked in, so we know and we can map incidents to the services and the code that defines that service and the teams who own that service. We've got our deployment system, which is Argo CD today. We've got Argo linked in, so we have deployment info, rollback info, things like that. I'm trying to think of what else we've connected. We have our AWS stuff is connected, so we have information about all the different resources and stuff there. It's less directly applicable to Edge Intelligence, but it is a good layer for our developers to figure out, like, what does my service depend on? So yeah, I think those are the main
Perfect.
things.
Yeah. That was super comprehensive. Thank you. Thinking about how you've actually got it set up right now, what number of teams are actually being monitored through Edge Intelligence? What are the types of teams? Like, how do you have that divided right now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, when we first onboarded to Cortex, we were mostly focused on teams that worked on SaaS services within Docker, because that's traditionally where you track things that are more, DORA metric, like deployments. Like for Docker Desktop, they only ship once a month. They always ship once a month. It's not a very interesting metric to measure, but we still do want them. We've moved on to onboard all the teams like that as well, because we do want them to get the information about PRs or their processes and things like that. So it's not as every team at Docker. So I think it's something like 18 teams at this point that are in Cortex in some way. Obviously, some are shipping more data than others, but it's the goal is everyone. This should be applicable to every engineering team. Every engineering manager should be able to look at this and understand, where's my team doing well, where can I help them improve? Yeah.
Perfect. And it's one thing to have access to viewing all the data across all the different teams. The next kind of question here is the reverse. So who actually has access to seeing this information? We've had a lot of folks tell us, oh, I'm not sure if I would want individual developers to be able to see this. I don't want people to feel like they're being compared directly to other people on other teams, or that I'm just measuring their performance based on this. But Brett, I think that you have a little bit of a different opinion here. Could you share more about that?
Yeah, I mean, Docker has a value of having open collaboration, transparency. Everything we do is very transparent inside the company. And so I think it's partially culture based, but you have to make sure that the way that you use this is what's important, and making sure that you show that this isn't being used as a stick, but as a tool to affect positive change. And that when managers are looking at this, they're not looking at this because they want to know, like, who's not doing a good job. They're looking at it because they want to say, oh wow, my team is really struggling here, how can I make that better? And I think the inverse is actually true. If we hid this data from engineers and we didn't let them know this data, then it becomes a very opaque process, and then people can't really trust, what are we doing with this, how is it being used, who's looking at this? But if it's open, it's very clear, like, hey, everyone has the same responsibilities here, everyone has the same access, and you can judge for yourselves whether this is being used in the right way or not.
Love that. Let's talk a bit then about some of the impact. Again, it's been pretty early days. You've been part of our early beta program, still exploring some new use cases, but what's an example of one of the use cases that you're thinking through right now?
I'll point out that we practically begged Mike for access to this when you guys told us you were working on it. Because that was the cool thing, is that we had already onboarded Cortex. We had all these things connected. We had all the data in there, but it was we didn't have a way to really collect that data and show it on a graph or publish reports very easily. And so, like, at some point we had just written a script to, like, hit Cortex's API and pull all this data down, do some number crunching, and shove it into a spreadsheet, which is like, that's the problem we're trying to solve as a platform team across the company, is like, we shouldn't have all these one-off processes everywhere. Like, we should be building tools or buying tools or procuring tools that help us do this and standardize it across the company. So yeah, I mean, that was the first use case, is just we got rid of some of those spreadsheets because now they're available inside Edge Intelligence. And I think the first thing, there's really two ways to look at how the company is using this. There's on the team level, so that's where individual managers and PMs should be looking at this and understanding where is their team struggling? Where can they use some help? Maybe it's takes a long time to get reviews, and that's really slowing down cycle time. We see that a lot. That's a hard one. And it's also about, at a company level, there's some things that you might tease out from here that we just don't do well as an organization, and that maybe there's a process or a way that we've done things that is making this worse. I'll give you one example. Is like, we know documentation is a pain point across pretty much every team at Docker, and that's internal documentation. Like, developers are not spending enough time documenting their stuff, or it's out of date, or you guys probably are familiar with this. Your wiki or your Notion is full of like 3 different pages on the same thing, and none of them is correct. Anyone been there? So I think being able to back that up with like saying, okay, this is a concern for the company. Now, once we start making changes, can we see those numbers change? That shows that we did the right thing. So I think we're right in the middle of starting to roll out those kinds of programs.
That's the use case that I'm particularly excited about, is what you described there at the end, around using engineering intelligence as kind of like an experimentation platform almost. And I think, we were talking about leading versus lagging indicators earlier, and I'm excited to see that kind of play out, because what we really want to happen in these conversations is, can organizations use engineering intelligence to capture the impact of changes they're making? Like, I think one of the things that happens with process changes is, like, you see something that's broken, you try to fix it, but just like, if you're changing your landing page, you might have the best intentions, but you might actually reduce your conversion rate on your demo form. Like, it could happen, right? And it's like, how do you know that unless you're tracking the metrics and you're capturing the impact, and then figure out, hey, were those changes we made actually useful? Were they positive? Were they negative? And so with engineering intelligence, what we're really excited about is being able to say, hey, let's go make these changes, let's drive those changes through Cortex. And let's like capture the impact of that and say, did we actually make a meaningful improvement? Like, was it worth the impact? Like, if we increase our deploy frequency by a certain amount, how much was the impact of the process that we changed? Are we seeing those improvements play out? So that's what I'm really excited about. So I'm glad y'all are finding that value in engineering intelligence that way.
Yeah, Brett, is there anything else that you'd want to add about how y'all are using it, or some of the initial reactions from your managers at the company?
Yeah, no, I think it's good so far. A lot of people, there's a lot of surprises in there, right? Like, oh, wow, our cycle time on PRs is pretty bad. Or one interesting thing we found is that it varies a lot from week to week. And it's even with a pretty good sample size. It's not like, there was 2 PRs last week and 1 PR this week, so of course it's going to be very different. Like, no, like dozens of PRs, and there's a pretty big gap in like just month to month, week to week, and trying to figure out, why is that? Is that a natural cadence for the team? Like, they have releases on the schedule, or this is how their sprints go, and so like they're just lining up all their deployments right before a sprint ends. So I think there's just been a lot of aha moments in figuring out, like, hey, what does this mean? And these are, in some cases, it's perfectly benign and it's cool. Okay, we understand that. Great, move on. And in some cases, it's, oh, there might actually be a problem here, or something that we can improve relatively easily, maybe. So that's kind of where we are. And I think, to the question about future plans, I think we have, there's obviously a lot of technical process that we can change to make things better, and that really falls on the platform teams. And another thing that we're spinning up as a company right now is our engineering operations team, and they focus more on the more engineering-wide process and the human parts of this, and the structural parts of this, and what can we improve there. So like, I don't know, maybe one example is we find that PR times are slower for teams that are across time zones. So as a company, as an engineering organization, should we accept that, or should we start trying to focus on building teams that are within time zones? I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. I don't know that there's a right or wrong, but it is interesting data. So yeah, we'll see.
Brett, I'm about to pass it over to Ganesh to go over some of our future plans, but while you have him on the hook here and in front of a full audience, is there anything else that you'd like to see in Edge Intelligence in the short term?
I think we've talked about it. I think the ability to, and I think you're working on some things like this, the ability to dive into, okay, cool, I've got this number, I'm concerned about this number. Why is this number this way? So like, if you have really high PR open to close times, like, can I click through and see which ones were over 10 hours or something like that? And maybe I can go figure out why. Oh, that one was just because it was a really big one. Okay, maybe we should make smaller PRs, or that person was out for a day. Fine, that's cool. We can ignore that. I think digging into that next level of granularity is the future part of this I'm most excited for. Yeah.
Promise he wasn't trained for that, because that is a screenshot
Good
of the next slide.
We've talked about it. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think
Cool.
there's one important thing to say here before I pass it over to Ganesh to talk a little bit more about the roadmap, which is that this is definitely a new way of thinking about this problem. So I think we feel comfortable sharing this slide about what's on the way right now, because we are still actively learning from folks about how this is most useful. We're also sharing with folks some of our impressions of how we think that they should be using this product to ensure that you're encouraging the developers and not using this in a punitive way. So there's lots more to do here, and we're pretty excited about that. We'd love to hear from folks about what they want to see, but go ahead, Ganesh. I won't steal your thunder anymore about what's on the way.
Yeah, super excited. One of the things that we are working on is exactly what Brett just described, which is more ways to break down the data and more ways to drill into the data. Because, like we mentioned, engineering intelligence is supposed to help you find bottlenecks, find areas for improvement. And so the more tools that we can give you to deep dive into that data, the better. And so one example is exactly what Brett mentioned, like PR cycle time. I want to be able to drill into that and say, like, hey, why is this metric changing over the last couple of weeks? Like, what are some PRs that are maybe skewing that data in a certain way? And that could help me. Imagine I'm a tech lead or an engineering manager. I come in and I see that metric and I find a PR that has 40 comments on it. Maybe there's something super contentious that is high risk and people are taking a lot of time like talking about it, debating it. Is maybe something that we want to get involved with, or maybe we pause and step back and say, like, hey, let's go back and dig into that conversation a little bit more, or et cetera, et cetera. There may be many different reasons for that, but being able to drill into the data and break down why those metrics are the way they are, I think will be really, really powerful. More customization of the layout. Today we have a fairly opinionated view of how this data is displayed. There's graphs and visualizations and historical trends and things like that. But there may be different things or different ways you want to slice that data, different things you want to showcase, maybe metrics you want to hide. Kind of going back to the cultural thing, a big part of engineering intelligence and these kind of productivity tools is going to be making sure that your culture is changing to accept these things as lagging indicators, but also tweaking the product to say, like, hey, these are the metrics that we really care about. And so we're going to hide everything else because these are metrics that we don't believe in as an organization. And so giving you the ability to customize things that way as well. And one of the other things that I am very, very excited about is even more deep ties to scorecards. So like Lauren mentioned earlier, scorecards in Cortex are a way to drive best practices, standards. So for example, automating your production checklist or automating your service maturity checks for a service. And so being able to say, like, hey, this service is meeting our gold level of maturity. This service is meeting our bronze level of service maturity. But can we then go back and say, like, hey, teams that have services or services that are in the gold level have lower incidence than services in the bronze level? That is now a clear piece of context that I can go back and say, hey, what are the things in service maturity in the gold level that potentially could be driving lower incident rates? Like, are those things actually working? So being able to create that feedback loop within scorecards, but then also, the other way around, like maybe you want to set goals or gamify some of these metrics actively with the knowledge of developers, right? Not telling them, hey, if you don't hit this number, this is a bad thing, but saying, hey, in our organization, the best teams are, shipping aspirationally at least twice a week. So can we create a scorecard that gamifies some of that and gives people clear goals of how they should be kind of working towards that with the context of things they should be doing to get there? So creating that feedback loop will be really powerful. And then additional like more data views. So whether it's a scatter plot to see kind of distribution of these metrics or historical trends, all those kinds of things are going to be part of engineering intelligence. But to Lauren's point, like I think this product is fairly new. We've been beta testing it internally and with folks like Brett for at least a few months now. But one of the things that we're really, really focused on is changing the conversation, right? Like this, for better or worse, engineering intelligence metrics are here to stay. Like everyone wants this kind of visibility. We should be using it for helping us make better data-driven decisions around our people, processes, improvements, bottlenecks, things like that. And a big focus area for us is going to be how do we keep building this product in a way that it can only be used in that way, and it's giving you visibility into those bottlenecks, giving you more insights that you can act on versus just being a punitive measurement tool. And so there's going to be a big focus area on that. And so if you have ideas things that you've seen worked really well. Would definitely love to hear your feedback around that. And it's one of the reasons why we actually don't show you lines of code shipped per developer. It's something that we just don't. We have the data because we have a lot of that information in Cortex, but we are opinionated on the metrics that matter because it should be intelligence. And so those are metrics that we actively are hiding from this product. And so if you have ideas of things that you want to see, please let us know because we want to help change the conversation in this space, and that's our biggest focus area.
It's great. Thank you. Sorry, wrong direction. If folks have questions, I'd love for you to kind of drop them in the Q&A. There's a couple that I wanted to go through right off the bat while folks start to think of things. One of the questions was going to be an example of something that you see in Edge Intelligence that you could change a rule and a scorecard for, but I think that you actually just covered that, Ganesh, I think in your example there.
Yeah, I think some obvious ones are like time to first review for PRs. I think PR size is a great indicator of like you probably shouldn't be opening 1,500 line PRs on the regular. I'm sure there are times where you're doing some meaty thing that all needs to go out at the same time, but it makes it super hard to review, and so people put it off for a while. Probably something you can target in a scorecard. Another one I know I mentioned this 1,000 times in this webinar, but like code coverage is such a simple one. Just having that visibility, like not setting necessarily like, oh, you have to be at 90%, but there's some reasonable number that you can set where if you're below that threshold, you're probably affecting your PR cycle time or your deploy frequency or even incident rates. And so being able to move that metric a little bit or at least find that correlation can be really interesting. The other thing around incident rates could be, we track MTTR, in one of the DORA metrics in engineering intelligence. And so things like ownership, like do you have clear ownership for all of your services so that when something goes wrong, you know exactly who to escalate it to? That's one of the things that we find at Cortex is one of the most impactful things for MTTR is if you can cut down that first 15 minutes of information gathering during an incident, your MTTR just plummets. And so like being able to drive that through a scorecard and say, hey, before you go into production, we expect that these basic invariants hold true for your service that we know every service should have. You should see that MTTR start to drop over time. And so there's some clear things where either the metrics themselves or the inputs to those metrics can be controlled through scorecards, and we're seeing those things happen already.
We probably only have time for one more question, but Brett, I think I'd also like you to answer it if you can. Some of the interesting things that we've seen so far as customers are starting to turn this on. I can provide one that I've seen firsthand already is actually that the PR processes are really healthy, which I think is actually a nice thing. I think we tend to go and look through this data and see, all right, what's wrong? Like, do we have a massive PR size somewhere or like really low time to review? But we forget about the more obvious use case, which is if you've got a lot of good practices set up, if you have good coaching on your team, if you have good onboarding practices, if you have healthy scorecards, healthy software, then these numbers are actually going to be a reflection of that hard work that you've done as a team. And actually be used to say, hey, actually, we're doing a pretty good job as a team so far. We don't really have any changes that we want to be making. And these others like software skills that we're starting to impart are actually having a positive impact. But Ganesh, Brett, I don't know if you've seen anything interesting yet as you're starting to look through some of the data.
Yeah, I can speak to some of that. I think we talked a little bit earlier about like traditional DORA metrics, and I think there's a lot of anxiety for management to like get those, just have those numbers and to understand. Like, I think that's one of the things that we answer here is like there are a lot of things that we may not know, and who knows what we'll uncover when we do. So an example of that for us was deployments. We started measuring that, and we're like, oh, I know we don't like industry benchmarking, but even when you look at industry benchmarks, we're deploying more than most companies. And I think that gave people a peace of mind that like, that's okay. That's not something we need to focus on right now. Like, I'm glad we have the number and we should make sure that it doesn't fall. But we're okay. Let's go focus on something else. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for us, even internally, some of the interesting things that we found was like PR review distribution. Like because we grew out the team so much, over the past 6 months, the folks that have been here for a long time were naturally kind of becoming bottlenecks for PR reviews. And so our PR time was starting to like kind of trend down over a little bit over the span of like 2 to 3 months. And there were a few folks on the team who were just like the number of PRs they're reviewing just kept going up and up and up. And like they were clearly becoming bottlenecks. And the rest of the team was ramping and it was slowly starting to increase. And so we made the decision to say like, hey, you know what? let's go and make sure that we're training people to be able to review things. Let's create more concrete code ownership in particular areas so that we can build that knowledge. Let's assign people to certain projects that we have more context there. And over the next 2-3 months, we saw that number kind of trickle back down on those individual contributors, and the PR cycle time kind of trend down as well across the board. And so being able to see that kind of trend up and trend back down and kind of correlate that back to some of the decisions we made, I think was super gratifying, because it was great for us as an organization to be able to ship faster again, but B, being able to use engineering intelligence internally, dog fooding or drinking our own champagne or however you like to describe it, to find the impact of the changes we're making was really, really cool. And our organization, we have about 30 odd engineers, and so being able to see that impact in an organization that size, I think speaks volumes. And so I'm really excited for organizations to continue adopting this and improve it. Because if we can cut down our PR cycle time by 50% in aggregate across the span of a year, that is a huge amount of engineering velocity and engineering time that can be spent on other things, beefing up our product, shipping more features. And so I'm super excited. And again, it was one of those things where it was a lagging indicator, right? It wasn't, I didn't go to the engineering team and say, hey, we have to improve our PR cycle time. It was more, brought it up in an engineering retro, like, hey, I'm trying to see this trend down. What are you guys feeling? Like, how is this going? Are you guys seeing bottlenecks? What are the things that are happening? And that kicked off a conversation, and then we decided on certain things we wanted to try, and then we were able to track and measure that, and then go back to retro a few months later and say, like, hey, look, guys, here's what we did. Here's how we improved it. What's next? And that way, it's kind of this continuous culture of continuous improvement. And so we were really proud of that internally. So I'm excited for other folks to try that as well.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. We are right at the top of the hour. Actually, we're just about a minute over. So really thank folks for joining us today. Brett, especially, thank you so much for your time. Thanks for spending so many cycles helping us with Edge Intelligence. Really appreciate it. Folks, if you have any questions about Edge Intelligence, feel free to visit the website. There's a page up on it, all about it right now. You can read more about it. There's a blog on the website, a couple of blogs that talk about how we think about using it, what thought went into actually building the product, and what you can do to actually check out a demo as well. So I think that's it. Thank you, everyone. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you all so much for attending. Thanks, Brett, for being part of this as well.
Thanks for having me.